Welcome to a Boxscore Geeks pick and roll, which is what we'll be calling these little segments where either Brian, who's our producer, so hey, say, oh wow, messed that up. Brian, say hey.
How's it going, everyone?
You may recall Brian, who played the voice of God in the last Boxscore Geeks pick and roll, where we discussed Russell Westbrook. Brian may pop in or not, depending on how the show is going. This week we have a special guest. We have EJ, aka Eugene Fischer. You can find his website at eugenefischer.com. He is Glorious Hubris on Twitter. EJ is a science fiction writer by vocation, as well as teacher, and happens to also be. I'll let you elaborate on this. Would you say you are the biggest Spurs fan, EJ? Do you know bigger Spurs fans than you that also know the advanced stats?
I mean, they that are also into advanced stats. I haven't found. I'm sure that there are people who are as into the Spurs as I am. I mean, you don't get Matt Bonner's face shaved into the back of your head unless you have a very pure passion for the team, and that certainly happened more than once in San Antonio. But I grew up in San Antonio. I lived there for 26 years. From elementary school through college, and yeah, you cut me and I'll bleed silver and black. So, I get misdiagnosed with sepsis pretty often, but I assure you, it's just my Spurs fandom.
I apologize. That's a really geeky joke. I was going to say I'm a fan of San Antonio. It is the home of Shawn Michaels, the Spurs, and Steve Jordan, who is the accordion player who sang a song for which I'm named. So the Spurs and San Antonio are both awesome. We're going to talk a little bit about Spurs are back in the finals. A surprise thing that doesn't happen that often. So we're going to talk a little bit about the playoffs so far and the Spurs being back in the finals, and then we're just going to talk about the amazingness of the Spurs in general, which is something you and I geek out on all the time on Twitter. I feel sorry for fans of both of ours because I know we've had several long threads where we're like, can you believe the Spurs do this? And you're like, actually, they did this. And I'm like, but actually. So let's start with the playoffs. You actually have a lot of good insight into this. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show as a Spurs fan is I consider myself a historian and researcher. You, as you mentioned, bleed Spurs. So I was really surprised by how close the Thunder were to the Spurs. Especially, I mean, the first two blowouts, there was no Ibaka, but it was still much closer than I was expecting. Flashbacks were going on in my head about, the last time they went up 2-0 to the Thunder. So what were some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm not sure it might even have been Arturo who at one point tweeted, who tweeted, like, I think either when it was 2-2 or maybe when the Spurs had gone up 3-2, that at some point the difference in point differentials has to mean something, right? Like, I don't think, like, the scores were never close. Like, the Spurs, when they won, were winning by a tremendous amount. And the Thunder were winning by, large amounts, but amounts that were exacerbated by the fact that, Popovich will, pull his starters early if the game seems out of hand.
He'll wave the white flag. Other
Right.
teams won't. He will.
Right. So the Spurs were having basically through 4 games. You had 4 games where the Spurs starters weren't playing in the fourth quarter, and they were all quote unquote blowouts. But the Spurs blowouts were actual blowouts, whereas the OKC blowouts were, in the 10 to 20 point range, not the 20 to 30 point range.
That was sick, and then the close end of that was perfect.
Yeah. Another thing is something that we learned. So it was, I mean, as a Spurs fan, I was getting flashbacks to 2012 when they tied it up 2-2 in Oklahoma City. And, I was telling people, I don't know if I can live through another one of these go up 2 and then get swept in the 4 that follow. But something that we learned was that, of course, Tony Parker came out at halftime in the last game of that series. And afterwards, after the game, when he was asked about it, Popovich said, we haven't made a big deal of it, but he sprained his ankle in Game 4 and re-aggravated it in Game 5. And he didn't come off the floor in those 2 games. So the offense was being run through an injured player in those 2 games where Oklahoma City suddenly seemed to turn into a different team. The combination of that and the reappearance of Ibaka seem to be things that should be taken hand in hand, because obviously Ibaka was very effective when he came back.
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is I got in an argument with someone because I think in game 3 or 4 when Ibaka came back, Russell Westbrook wasn't playing hot. That was something I was talking about with Brian where, Russell Westbrook, even though he had some amazing games, he had some horrible games. And someone pointed out to me, they said, well, he's not doing well on offense, but defense matters, and he's shutting down Tony Parker. And to me, that was absurd at the time because Ibaka was back. Ibaka, when he said that, like Ibaka blocked one of Tony Parker's shots. I was like, yeah, Russell Westbrook's defense seems oddly contingent on Ibaka being in the game, exacerbated, as you said, I'm stealing your word, with the fact that, Tony Parker was injured. And it's like, oh, okay, Russell Westbrook didn't turn a corner and turn up the D. Two things came together. A really good player came back, and a really good player got hurt.
Yeah. And, I don't think Russell Westbrook had a bad series. I think he had a good series. He just didn't have...
You're getting me to look it up, so I'll let you keep going, but I'm going to comment on that in just a second.
I've tweeted before, if you are on the same team as Kevin Durant and you're taking the most shots and your name isn't Kevin Durant, then you're doing something wrong. And so I frequently feel like Russell Westbrook is doing something wrong.
Do you want to know the fun story behind that? He finished with 123 shots to Kevin Durant's 122.
There you go. So he very mildly did something wrong in my book in this.
Well, to be fair, they both had much worse. Well, actually, Russell Westbrook played about his season average in true shooting percentage, 54.4%. Kevin Durant, though, looked human. He was only 56% true shooting. And remember, he was in God mode through a lot of the season. That's why I got the MVP.
And, who was guarding him most of the time? It was Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard.
Yeah, one thing I will say about that series is that Russell Westbrook, I think the funny thing, it's kind of like grading on a curve. I think he looked like himself during that season, but looking like yourself when you're playing the Spurs is actually impressive. Because as we mentioned, Kevin Durant looked nothing like himself. If we want to really point fingers in that series, I want to make this clear. I just had a podcast about how I said Russell Westbrook's overrated. It was not really Westbrook's fault. It was like the fact that Kendrick Perkins was getting tons of minutes. Kendrick Perkins and Derek Fisher both got major minutes in important games, and you look at the coach and you go, really? You're going to play Perkins and Fisher. Scotty Brooks will not give up on those two players.
No, there was one game where Perkins got like 3 fouls early, and I was pissed off because that meant that Scotty Brooks was going to be forced to play a better player. It's like, I want Perkins on the floor.
Yeah, Perkins hasn't been effective in years, and yet Scotty Brooks, it was only the 7th most minutes, but still, he played Perkins and Fisher both over 100 minutes in that series, and I think that mattered.
No, I did not think that Westbrook was hurting his team at all during this series. I thought that he was contributing to their success. But the Spurs are a better team.
There was one interesting thing you mentioned on the pre-show that you said people often call the Thunder an athletic team, but that actually means something else. And I really liked your take on this. I hadn't heard this.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that people are saying when they say the Thunder are an athletic team is that the Thunder are a fast team. Serge Ibaka and Russell Westbrook are both so fast that they can get away with things that another player wouldn't be able to get away with. And we saw 2 really big examples of that. Now that we have like the microscope on every play that is like a Western Conference Final Series, there was that steal that Westbrook got where he ran out of bounds to get this, like both feet completely out of bounds. It wasn't marginal at all, but he was running so fast that when he grabbed the ball from out of bounds and immediately ran back inbounds and streaked towards the basket, the refs didn't catch it. He was just moving too fast for them to get it in the moment. Similarly, that call that could have been series defining and luckily wasn't, because the Spurs ended up winning in overtime. But in Game 6, towards the end, Serge Ibaka had a goaltend on a layup attempt by Manu Ginobili. In the slow motion, it was clearly, he clearly got to the ball after it hit the backboard and was still moving up, which should be a goaltending call. And people talk, when people are complimenting like the shot blocking ability of Tim Duncan, one of the things they compliment is he has a really good ability to block the ball in a way where he retains control of it. He doesn't knock it into the stands. And this is an efficient form of shot blocking. Well, Serge Ibaka has almost found sort of a version of efficiency at the other end of that, which is that he's able to block so fast that the sort of legality of blocks becomes extremely difficult for the referees to question.
Huh. Yeah, and by the way, I'll have to make sure I look. There was a Sloan paper on that basically said Tim Duncan was a better shot blocker than Dwight Howard because, and this actually follows the wages of wins kind of efficient use of possessions, get the ball, keep the ball,
Right.
score efficiently is, yeah, Tim Duncan blocks the ball, his team gets the ball, Dwight
Yeah.
Howard swats it into the stands. And fans out there, I noticed you don't always answer the call, but if you can here, I'll make sure to question it. There was a fantastic interview with Marcus Camby where he talked about this, where he actually said, when you first start shot blocking, you want to look impressive and do the, scream afterwards. He's like, but you eventually learn that, if you just tip the ball a certain direction. Amazing interview. I haven't been able to find it. So if anybody knows what I'm talking about, put it in the comment section, please. So, EJ, anything else to say on that series before we move on to finals narratives?
Well, everything else I have to say about that series involves finals narratives. So that seems like.
So let's get to it. You've got your finger on the pulse of Spurs finals narratives and Spurs history and the narratives you've had to tell yourself over history. So what do we got?
So, you've seen The Godfather, right?
Many times.
Yeah, so there's that bit at the end of The Godfather where Michael Corleone announces, tonight I'm settling all family business. And what follows is a montage of just everyone who's gone up against the family in the previous 2 hours getting assassinated. This postseason run is starting to feel a little like that to me. Because you go, like the Spurs, for all of their unbelievable success, have had a lot of heartbreak as well, like a lot of really near misses. You could argue that they were only like 2 plays away from being in the finals 5 consecutive times, from 2003 to 2007. So you look
and
at
you're leaving out the tarmac in 2008, which surprises
right,
me.
and I'm leaving out the tarmac in 2008. I don't know what can ever fix that, but yeah, the tarmac in 2008 was a pretty big deal as well. But you go back to 2006, and you think it went to 7 games against the Mavericks, and Manu Ginobili fouls Dirk Nowitzki on a 3-point shot. At the end of regulation, he sinks all 3 3-pointers. It goes to overtime. The Spurs lose in overtime to miss their second chance in 4 years to try to repeat as champions. And this goes down in Spurs history. Well, this postseason run began against the Mavericks with Dirk Nowitzki. It went to 7 games, and this time we won Game 7. So that feels like it was sort of crossing something off the list.
And you blew out Game 7 too.
Yeah, and we blew out Game 7. Then you go to this Western Conference Finals. Well, 2 years ago we went up 2 games on them, and then they won 4 straight. So beating the Thunder in the Western Conference Finals was a big deal. But even more than that, think back to 2004. When Derek Fisher became one of the most hated men in Spurs history, with his .4 second shot to take the series lead when the Spurs played the Lakers. And Tim Duncan had just made what would have been one of the most amazing shots of his career, a buzzer beater shot over Shaquille O'Neal. That's astonishing and is completely forgotten because then with .4 seconds left on the game clock, Fischer buries a 3 and wins the game. Fischer has been hated by Spurs fans for a decade now because of that. And every time, and seems, the sort of mentality in Spurs fandom is that like he basically turns into Michael Jordan when he plays against the Spurs, even though he's not a very good player.
Yeah, I've written on that too, where Fischer had a series where he was, I think, the second best Laker. He was absurd. And Kobe people claim he turns it on when it matters, and the data doesn't support this. He doesn't play better in the playoffs. In fact, his playoffs are very hit and miss. To be fair, the last 2 finals he was very good. But Fischer is this player where you can actually make the point, you're like, he does seem to have a playoff mode, which is very odd.
Yeah, I have tweeted it so many times that my phone now recognizes as one word just the concatenated words "hate Derek Fisher." Like that's no longer a misspelling in my phone. But hey, what happened this postseason? He ended his career with a Western Conference Finals loss to the Spurs. That's really satisfying. So what's the one big one that I'm not saying? Well, it's coming 28 seconds away from winning a championship and then having it all slip through their fingers last year. But who are we playing in the finals? The Miami Heat. So if they manage to win the championship this year, 3 of their 4 postseason series will have been, in some sense, a reversal of some previous heartbreak.
This sounds really weird. How am I forgetting this? Who was their second series this year?
It was the Trailblazers.
Man, there's nothing really much there.
I mean,
it would have been nice for Houston, but even then, there's not a narrative with Houston. Is there? I guess Harden, but not.
I mean, the narrative with Houston kind of can't ever be fixed. It's the Robinson Olajuwon narrative, is the only one we really have with Houston. Which, as you know, is one of my favorite topics, as I'm firmly on Team Admiral over Team Dream. But
I mean, in this case, it's one of those I consider it a silly argument because it's either I can see like there are arguments where I'm like you're wrong. Like Kobe versus Magic is not an argument.
Oh yeah,
no. Kobe versus Michael Jordan, though, I'm like yeah, sure, I'll give you either. We can come away from this, and you'll tell me I'm wrong, and I'll agree. So like David Robinson versus Hakeem. I can't really care about because I'm like, yeah, they're both great, and neither was on my team, so whatever.
Sure.
Now that said, are there any? Go ahead.
Blazers. The one nice thing about the Blazers is that if this does end up being Tim Duncan's last time going to the finals, which I'm not at all sure of, but if it does, it will be kind of nice to have the Blazers tucked in there because the Blazers were the first playoff opponent in 1999 when he made his first run to the finals.
Ooh. So it's nice poignant. I was going to say, to me on that, something that's kind of interesting, just from a narrative perspective, you and I have actually had a few podcasts talking like writing and stuff. I'd kind of like to see Manu and Tim retire at the same time and get inducted into the Hall. First ballot, if they don't, oh my God, voters.
Well, they should both be. I mean, Tim Duncan will obviously be first ballot Hall of Fame. Like, there's.
I was talking Ginobili, and I'm saying if Ginobili isn't first ballot Hall of Fame.
I mean, he certainly should be. It's not the NBA Hall of Fame; it's the Basketball Hall of Fame. And there are only 2 players that have ever won a EuroLeague championship, Olympic gold medal, and an NBA championship. And one of them is Manu Ginobili.
Yeah. So I mean, he belongs 100%. If he doesn't, I mean, I was already talking about Dikembe Mutombo, and I'm expecting him to muck up there, but. Manu Ginobili, slam dunk as a Hall of Famer. First ballot. I want first ballot to be this.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. He should be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Are there any other finals narratives that you would like to discuss? I really like the Godfather take.
Yeah, so this is the Godfather postseason for me. But I will say, like, the thing that is being talked about right now, I'll throw this one out there as a false narrative, is the idea of that Tim Duncan has started trash talking the Heat, because in after Game 6 of the Thunder series, he was asked, so you're going to face the Heat again. How do you feel about that? And he said, we want the Heat. We still have a bad taste in our mouth for last year. And then what he said was, because I listened to this post conference, the video is on NBA.com. You can go and watch it. What he said was, hopefully we'll get it done this year, which is a very Tim Duncan thing to say. How he was quoted was as saying, we'll get it done this year, i.e. like calling his shot, saying, faux, we're going to win. And then everyone quotes the quote. And now the thing that's out there is that he said, we'll get it done this year. And people are asking LeBron James, well, what do you think about Tim Duncan saying, we'll get it done this year? And I'm saying, they're a professional organization, but I get that, they probably don't like us very much. I'm getting that from Tim Duncan. It's completely manufactured. What he said was, hopefully we'll get it done this year.
So by the way, and I've got this as a link because we have some research links we have up, and I'll definitely include it in the post. One of my favorite YouTube videos is after the 2007 finals.
Yes.
Tim Duncan goes up to LeBron James and says, dude, just keep doing what you're doing. You're going to own this league in a few years. Thanks for letting us get this one. Which, I mean, if you're talking calling your shot, that's Tim Duncan literally calling the shot, where he's just like, yeah, I bet in a couple of years you're going to get multiple MVPs and multiple finals, and I'm glad you let me squeak by. And if we're talking false narratives, I think I mentioned this on Twitter and you laughed at it, I said, I can't believe I'm going into the finals. I'm saying this team is pretty old and pretty beat up, and this is probably their last chance as constructed to win a finals. And I'm talking about the Heat. I'm not talking about the Spurs. Because that's been the narrative behind the Spurs since 2007.
who ever imagined after the sort of Spurs Lakers stuff from the early 2000s that like now this is going to be the third time Tim Duncan and LeBron James have faced each other in the finals, and they're tied 1-1. Like,
Well,
who saw that one coming back in 2007?
and I mentioned that too on Twitter. I said I can't believe that Tim Duncan versus LeBron James is the rivalry. I was expecting the Durant LeBron James rivalry, and with how Brooks coaches and how the Oklahoma City front office runs things, that may never come to fruition. That may be sad. This may be a Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley scenario. But
They at least met once, right?
Yeah, but so did LeBron James and LeBron James and Kevin Durant. Sorry, Brian messaged me and it briefly knocked me out of my zone.
Yeah.
I'm not a clutch player in the playoffs. But yeah, they met once, but that's the point is, in 1991, 1992, Jordan and Barkley met and had an epic 6-game finals where the Bulls won, but the Suns outscored them, and it's like, all right, here we go. And that's it. That's the end of that rivalry. Whereas what you've got here is Tim Duncan and LeBron James, 3 times in 6 years? That's absurd.
Yeah, and between the two, like when they take the court, but you realize like between the two of them, those guys have 6 championships and 6 MVP awards.
Yeah, Arturo and I were talking about this a bit ago. We get in arguments about longevity and mattering in players. Because, for instance, Kobe Bryant has been a good player his career, but if you look at his peak, he just didn't touch, and I'm going to include Manu Ginobili here. He did not touch.
Manu's peak was higher than Kobe's.
Exactly. So that's what I'm saying. If you look at Kobe Bryant's peak and try and put him in the annals of shooting guards, pretty much he doesn't touch some of the greats like Michael Jordan, Manu Ginobili, Clyde Drexler. But if you look at him as a career, he's been around forever.
Yeah.
Then you go, okay, he's had a really impressive career, and yeah, he does belong in the Hall easily first ballot. He's a great player. That's what I'm saying. Tim Duncan, though, he has played so well for so long. I think I mentioned that too. It's like he outplayed Kevin Durant in the last game, and he did it fewer minutes, and he's got the most minutes of any Spurs in this playoffs.
I mean, one of the things that one of the links that I sent you guys was there's a link that just went up by one of the guys at the Express News, the San Antonio Express News, put together an oral history of Tim Duncan. That's just like quotes on different topics throughout his career. And it's fascinating to read. And one of the things that like comes through in this is the guy's work ethic. This is someone who taught himself a new running stride after his knee got bad enough that he needed to wear a brace. And it took him a little while to figure it out and to drop the weight to make it work. But there can't be that many accomplished players who already have championships under their belt, players who are already like into their 30s, who have the drive and the desire to win, to be willing to change the way they run to be better, to be more effective on the court. Like there was like the Shane Battier quote about Ray Allen a little while ago, another player who's remained very effective, very old, saying he keeps his body in pristine condition. I don't. That's the difference between us. Well, Tim Duncan keeps his body in pristine condition. He does what is necessary to continue to be effective with a really sort of studious intensity.
Well, I mean, that's what's really funny to me about sports, because I've read about that. And I was reading the Dr. J autobiography, and Dr. J mentions that he got a groin injury, and basically the way he was running was pulling him a different way, so he had to change things up to keep going. But having that level of foresight to say, look, Tim Duncan could have said in 2004, my career is, it's probably my last contract. Who cares, right? Let's just finish it up. But, doing that keeps him going. And I think Steve Nash, I recall, is someone who's done something similar, where he changed his diet up a lot because he was injury prone and doing so much stuff. So he changed his diet a lot and does a lot more stretching. So it's like, yeah, these greats, and I have to give it to Kobe too, German scientist or not, the ones that keep going forever, I don't think people realize the level of dedication it takes, especially if you're a millionaire that already has all the accolades.
Yeah, no, I mean one of the sort of most telling things I ever read about Michael Jordan, because Michael Jordan is usually talked about as sort of this demigod-like preternatural talent, and of course he was, but also, he would be watching, 3 times as much video as anyone else on that team. And before a game, like even before meaningless games, would like do personal video sessions, intensely studying whoever he expected to be going at on the other team. Like he was also, took a scholarly interest in knowing his opposition. And I don't think like I would be surprised that it's possible to be Michael Jordan without, in some facet of your game, giving it that kind of attention. Like it, I haven't read anything about LeBron James putting in like this specific detailed focus, but I would be shocked if it weren't the case that he's doing something somewhere like that.
Yeah, I mean, especially and Durant. Him and Durant, I wish we had access to this. This is one of the missing analytics pieces. The locker room, the off season. That was one thing I heard Magic Johnson and Larry Bird would give each other credit for. Magic Johnson said, in the off season, I would shoot 800 shots a game or a day because I knew somewhere Larry Bird was shooting 800 shots a day. Yeah, I keep saying game. And that kind of thing. It's like you look at how good they've stayed and how they've even improved, and you go, they're not doing in the off season. They're not just taking a time off. They can't be. You can't sustain this level of top athleticism. And yeah, to that point, Tim Duncan is kind of the pinnacle of that. So we obviously moved into the Tim Duncan top. I was actually going to end with Tim Duncan, but you know what? He's a fantastic third. I don't know what else to say about Tim Duncan. I mean, Arturo and I already mentioned we think he's the Mount Rushmore for the post-Jordan, pre-LeBron era NBA.
I mean, the argument always used to be, who is the face of the post-Jordan generation? Is it Shaq or is it Duncan? Like back when, Lakers Spurs was a big rivalry, that was the question people asked. And I don't think that you get to ask that question anymore. I mean, you look at the period you look at the period after Jordan and before LeBron, and I think that, the only reasonable answer at this point is Tim Duncan.
And I mean, to what we were just saying, Shaq is a perfect example of the opposite thing, where he'd show up to camp overweight. He'd know he was going to miss 20 games in the regular season and say, "Hey, I'm just here, to win in the postseason." He'd put off surgery, he injured his toe and stuff. So it's like, I mean, he was a great player, but I think obviously, and there's absolutely nothing against that, to be fair. Shaquille O'Neal is one of the greatest of all times in saying, "Hey, you know what? You want to work on your rap career, you want to work on your movie career, you want to do other stuff." There is nothing wrong with that, but I mean that's just the separation.
Players' individual goals with what they're doing with their career, and Shaq's goal was Shaq has made a lot more money over his career than Tim Duncan has. I don't think Shaq ever took a contract reduction for the sake of the team.
I think with the exclusion of when he ended up on Boston, right?
Yeah,
but I think that was
Boston, but that was like a stunt. I mean, did anyone think that was going to work?
He played really well, but yeah, it was like, can he last? No, he can't.
That was the year where Boston basically cornered the market on big men who had been really good.
That was I wrote a piece. It's dead because I used to have, on Nerd Numbers. I used to have a blog, and I invented something called like the Wayback Machine or something, where I would take a list of players in their prime season, compare them with the current season's averages, and say how good that team could have been. So you've got Jermaine O'Neal, Shaquille O'Neal, Kevin Garnett all on a team together. You're like, holy cow, this is a 70-win team if you have a time machine.
Right, exactly.
All right, so the last, by the way, like I said, I wrote this down as a question, but I'm not even going to hide the premise, and I buried the lead when I talked to you pre-show, is there's always this question, are the Spurs a dynasty? And this is a dumb question. I'm sorry. If anybody asks this is stupid. Here's the stat I read to EJ before. There are 6 teams that are, or 5, the top 5 teams that have had consecutive seasons of 5 or more with a 60% win percentage. The Spurs are number 1 at 17. They beat the number 2, which is the Los Angeles Lakers with Magic Johnson from 1980 to 1991 by 5 seasons. That is absurd. Only 17 teams in the history of the NBA have managed to muster 5 seasons or more of 60% win percentage or better. 60% win, by the way, I use that because of lockout seasons, and the NBA season used to not be as long. That is absurd. That is how much better the Spurs are than second place in the Tim Duncan era. And it's really weird to call the Tim Duncan era because it overlaps several other, like what you could call eras. Tim Duncan's era is 2 decades at this point.
Yeah. I have said many times to many friends that the Tim Duncan era has ruined me for life because I am simply never going to have another period where I have as much sustained joy as a sports fan as I have having been a fan of the Spurs during the Tim Duncan era, because this kind of success just doesn't happen. And when I say it just doesn't happen, I mean it's never happened before. Over the last 17 years, they have over a 70% win percentage. That doesn't happen.
And yeah, even the Lakers, you had this. Actually, Lakers fans should be upset because there were several foibles in that, bad draft picks. Jerry West did very well with like Magic and stuff, but for all their success, they made mistakes as well. But I mean, that was the last case, the 12, and then Boston from 57 to 68 is also tied in second, but that was in a different era, with much fewer teams. So it's like,
on the dynasty question, I mean, the thing that people point to when they try to argue that the Spurs aren't, is the lack of consecutive championships. And I already mentioned how many sort of like near misses the Spurs had. They could have been in the finals, 5 times in a row from 2003 to 2007, and perhaps even 6 if they weren't stuck on a tarmac in 2008. When they were the defending champions.
And of course they had the Derrick Rose issue where round 1 they gotten unlucky. The Memphis Grizzlies have done this multiple times now where they're a better team than they appear, but they've had injuries, so they go into the playoffs with a worse record than that team actually is.
Next year we got swept by the Memphis Grizzlies, but we got swept by the Memphis Grizzlies because Manu Ginobili broke his arm in the last game of the regular season.
And as I mentioned, if you looked at the Memphis Grizzlies, they like Marc Gasol was clearly injured to start the season. They come back, but in the Western Conference, if you drop 5 or 10 games in the first half of the season that you shouldn't have dropped, well, you're not going to make a good seed. Like that's how absurd the Western Conference is. And that was also something that you were saying about sustained success. We were talking before the show. The Southwest Division is over the last decade, 2 decades, because one of the teams on this list, number 4, is Dallas with 11 consecutive seasons from 2001 to 2011. This is one of the strongest divisions there's ever been in the history of basketball.
Have done this in the toughest division. The Southwest Division is just murder every year. There was those years where you had the Spurs in San Antonio, the Nowitzki-Nash Mavericks in Dallas, and the McGrady-Yao Rockets in Houston. And, Texas had sort of 3 legit either contender or dark horse contender teams just beating the crap out of each other over the course of a season every year.
Well, what I'll also say on the dynasty, though, to your point, is you won't have the sustained success. The thing to consider, though, is the Spurs aren't done. Tim Duncan is amazing. That's true, right? They are a 60-win team, and losing Tim Duncan will hurt. But Tim Duncan's not the Tim Duncan he was. He's not the 20-win Tim Duncan in his prime when he was winning MVPs. He's like a 12-win, but the playoffs, by the way, the playoffs are absurd. His knowledge there is just ridiculous. But I'm saying, even if you take Tim Duncan and maybe even Manu Ginobili off, that's still a winning team, and they have some good young pieces. And Arturo's got some pieces in the draft. Like I said, the Spurs honestly look like they're reading off of Arturo's sheet. I think that they are, and basically what I'm saying is the Spurs and Arturo do the same stuff.
Yeah,
what I'm saying is the Spurs are going to be fine. They may not, it's hard to replace a talent like Duncan. I don't denigrate that, but I'm saying they're going to stay in the 50s.
I think that it's going to be harder to replace Popovich. Like I really liked that Nate Silver piece that analyzed how Popovich always beats Vegas's expectations, and he seems like a good bettor to have a sense of when certain things are getting overused or are underused, and know, like he knows where the inefficiencies are, where the next new inefficiency is to take advantage of. The Spurs were ahead of the curve on the corner of 3. The Spurs were ahead of the curve on international players.
They're still ahead of the curve on international players.
Right.
I'm amazed at how many teams are, and like, I don't know if you recall, I think 2 drafts ago, a team drafted an international player who wasn't even eligible. That shows how poor their scouting was. I'll try and look it up. We've got a few days for me to get the link, so I'll try and look that up. But yeah, the Spurs are still much better.
Popovich claims that when Tim Duncan walks out the door, he's going to be right behind. And if you look at that other article that I linked, the Duncan Popovich story, you can see just the degree to which it's the relationship between those two men that have defined the Spurs culture. And the minute, like, obviously, like, things are going to be very different when Tim Duncan walks out the door. The minute Greg Popovich walks out the door, you might as well rename the team. Like, it's going to be a different Spurs team. Um, like, hopefully he'll be replaced by someone like ideally they would get Mike Budenholzer back from he's coaching the Hawks now, right? For years, everyone thought that the person who was going to take over for Pop was Mike Budenholzer, but he got the head coaching offer from, I believe, the Hawks. So he's doing that now. But I would love him to come back to San Antonio when Popovich leaves.
Pops is another one of those you're like, yeah, one more year, and that was a decade ago.
Yeah. But the other thing I would say is, so as you pointed out, just by like over a standard deviation, we've never had a team exhibit this kind of longevity before. And so also when you're asking the question, what is a dynasty? Well, all of our other discussions of that are based on teams that have not had this kind of longevity. So say you win 3 championships in a row and then you suffer a tough loss. If you're the Lakers with an infinitely deep pocket and the draw of Hollywood to get any free agent you want, well, then what you do is you blow up the team. So obviously the dynasty is over. If you're the Spurs, who are at a financial disadvantage both because they're in a small market and because they're a former ABA team and therefore subject to that deal that takes some ABA team revenue.
Although they finally bought that out.
I know they finally bought that out now, but over the last 17 years, it's still been in effect.
Yeah.
And the Spurs have been doing all of this from a financial disadvantage. They've only gone into the luxury tax 2 or 3 times because they can't afford to. If you're doing that, you have to, you don't blow up your team. You figure out how to make the best of what you have and you build carefully, because mistakes, and like by mistakes, let's just use that as a euphemism for, say, Richard Jefferson. Mistakes will really cost you for several years.
But even that was what's remarkable. I thought Richard Jefferson was a mistake, but to be fair, I thought Bellinelli, I felt the exact same way. I said, they're overpaying this guy. What are they doing? And Bellinelli worked out. So for all I know, if Richard Jefferson comes back and plays at star level for 2 years, and I'll just go, all right, I'll be fair. When I'm critical of the Spurs, I'm wrong more often than I'm right. And with Jefferson, don't forget, they convinced him to leave the option on the table, sign for less money, and then traded him away.
Yeah, no, once they had him, they handled him perfectly. There have been exactly 2 front office moves in the last 17 years that I've really disliked on the Spurs. One of them was the signing of Richard Jefferson, which was a reaction to what Boston did, and I felt an overly hasty reaction. And my only explanation is I think that Popovich remembered him from the New Jersey series as a better player than he had.
If you looked, I talked to another quant, his name is Chris Chan, who told me if you looked at where Richard Jefferson was really effective from, he was amazing. I think it was from corner threes. And so basically they were trying to get another corner 3-point shooter. And then, of course, they probably also remember he used to be great.
Right. But the Richard Jefferson signing and the trading of Luis Scola for cash.
Oh, they hated that. Remember, Popovich am I wrong? Popovich has talked about that in interviews.
Yeah, Popovich hated it, yeah.
And to be fair, though, it was a short-term one, because Luis Scola, he was kind of a Maury Stoudemire, so that he had a shelf life. He lasted, I think, 4 good years, and then after that, he's just crumbled.
Yeah, but those 4 good years, as Fabricio Oberto started having heart trouble, and we started rotating through backup centers, people like Nazi Mohammed, it might have been nice to have Scola.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I'm saying those 2 mistakes. I'm not going to give the Scola one that much because that's a required hindsight one.
Yeah.
To say it wasn't that bad, but I'm saying the Jefferson one with how they handled it, that's another thing. It's the sunk cost thing. They don't fall for the sunk cost on players. That
what happened with Scola informed the way they eventually got Tiago Splitter to come over, because he had a contract that had to get bought out, and I think they decided we're not gonna Scola this one.
That's a funny term to call something. So, by the way, I've got let's see. I'm trying to think if I want to ask this. No, I think I'll let you end up the dynasty discussion, and we'll go to shoutouts.
Right. So you think about the Showtime Lakers. They didn't repeat until their last 2 championships, and but for 28 seconds in Game 6 last season, this could be a circumstance now where we're looking at the Spurs potentially repeating. They've been a continual championship contender the entire time Duncan has been in the league. They have 17 straight years of 70% win percentage, which has, as you pointed out, never been done before in NBA basketball, and I think has likely never been done before in any of the major sports.
And to be fair, even in basketball, right, there things used to be easier, right? The Boston Celtics streak, I will denigrate it because it's like when there are fewer teams and and in the stacked team, there's no restricted free agent. There's only restricted free agency. That's easy.
11 championships in 13 years. Boston Celtics did not have as good a sustained winning percentage for as long as the Spurs now do. Like, that is how wildly good they have been in a much league.
Well, I've written about this too. I mean, the playoffs, I enjoy the playoffs, but there's so much randomness in it. As I've been writing more and more, I've progressively gotten against prediction and saying, look, it's really hard to predict a lot of this stuff, playoffs especially. I'm doing terrible in the Boxscore Geeks challenge, by the way. And I'm just saying, that's what you can look at. You can look at their regular season wins. You can look at their opponents, and that's where you get it. Actually, I do want to ask my question.
Deep playoff runs every year. Like, my question is a 0.4-second shot a losing in overtime of Game 7 and like 28 seconds in Game 6 last year? Do those cumulative 6 minutes of basketball make the difference between a dynasty and not a dynasty?
Oh my God, that is a beautiful quote. I'm stealing that. That's beautiful.
I think those 6 minutes are only really important to you if you have a vested interest in some other team being sort of narratively better than the Spurs. If you're a disinterested observer, then I don't think there's any way to value those so highly that the Spurs aren't a dynasty.
Actually, I will ask my question. This is the last one. So I've finished David and Goliath this year. If you haven't read the book, it's a great one. I'd advise you read it. I know you read a ton, so maybe you have time or don't. But
I've been mostly reading fiction, but this I'm guessing is nonfiction.
I'm the nonfiction. Between the two of us, yeah. I'm the major nonfiction person. So in it, Malcolm Gladwell basically talks about how we have these perceptions of advantages and disadvantages, and sometimes that's wrong. So his point is, if you look at the David and Goliath narrative, the power of a sling was like as much as a handgun. And David was really, really good and accurate with the sling. And Goliath is this big guy and probably has gigantism and is probably half blind. And so this isn't a contest, right? The disadvantages of size are overstated because he actually has the advantage of being accurate and having a handgun.
Right.
Arturo and I were talking about the Spurs, and we mentioned that, there's a major issue with the Cavaliers and other teams with the #1 draft pick, which is if we tell you John Wall is the person to take. Which was John Wall the same draft as Kawhi? Or was it Irving was the same draft as Kawhi? So if we tell you, you have to take this player, you have to take John Wall, he's the consensus, and the analytics person in your team comes and says, look, your best bet is to trade down or to take this other guy. And you go, I can't do that. Everybody's looking at me. And I mentioned, well, the Spurs, they've had the 28th pick 5 times, whereas the Cavaliers have had the #1 pick 4 times. And you go, is it actually an advantage to be the Spurs with some of the stuff you're looking for? Because now, instead of saying we have money to throw around and we'll just go for the top points per game player, you go, we have to find these underrated players. We have to find these players that other teams are overlooking the value of. We have to use our draft picks wisely, and we don't have to give a damn what people think because they're in the late 20s. Is the Spurs situation... And then also, it seems like there's a lot of talent in Texas, at least analytics-wise, right? All of the Texas teams are really good. Is it possible the Spurs are actually not the underdog in the story here? They actually have a lot of small advantages that cumulatively make them the great team they are?
I mean, I think that... the advantage is Greg Popovich and the front office that he's put together, combined with, obviously, getting David Robinson, and then while you still have David Robinson getting Tim Duncan, that's pretty huge. In one of those, the oral history of Tim Duncan, or maybe it was the Duncan Popovich one, I can't remember. I think it was the oral history of Tim Duncan one. The Celtics thought they were going to get him, and Rick Pitino had been coaxed away from college ball to coach the Celtics, sort of on the basis of getting to coach Tim Duncan in the NBA. And Rick Pitino, had to tell his GM, just as a matter of due diligence, once the Spurs won the #1 pick, call Greg Popovich and see if he'll trade the #1 for the 3 and the 6. And Popovich was very gracious, well, thank you for offering. We think we're going to keep the #1 this year.
Did he cackle?
No, he did. Although apparently, like he was so sure they weren't getting the number one pick that when everyone else went into the room to actually see the lottery, he stayed behind to fix himself a hamburger, and like he saw it on a television monitor and reports dropping his hamburger on the ground and then turning around and seeing this group of people rushing at him.
Yeah, jeez.
But so like getting a player like Tim Duncan who remains as good as he has for 17 years, obviously like that's a lot of luck, but I think that people like you and Dave Barry and Arturo, and Patrick and all of the now we'll use the umbrella term Boxscore Geeks to use this have sort of fairly conclusively demonstrated that this in much the same way that sort of famous introduction to Moneyball puts it, like the Oakland A's were clearly doing something different than the rest of the teams. The Spurs are clearly doing something different than the rest of the teams. Some other teams might be doing it now too, but for a long time the Spurs have clearly been doing something different. Whenever there's a story about some like new thing that sports teams are doing, and they go like, oh, in Phoenix they've just bought one of these cryo saunas because of this new cutting edge research about the muscle regeneration or whatever. And then the local beat reporter for the Express News asked, hey, there was just this report about cryo saunas, and asked one of the Spurs people, and like they never advertise this stuff, and you never see these reports written about what new thing the Spurs are doing, but the Spurs, when asked directly, will always confirm, yes, we have one as well. Like, there's never been one of those articles where it doesn't turn out that the Spurs were also doing that. And some of the stuff is just visible. Like, no one, in 10 years, people having this kind of conversation are going to be talking about how every successful team has an aggressive minutes management program. And are going to point to the year where Popovich didn't play any of his players as many as 30 minutes a game as like the start of the minutes management revolution in the NBA. Like that's clearly this thing that only the Spurs are doing right now that's paying major dividends.
One interesting thing, which is funny because in Moneyball, the story, right, is Oakland's doing all these new things, but they never have postseason success, which is dumb. They were amazing teams. I have a lot to say on Moneyball too, though. The agency and the management wasn't as cohesive as people lead on. But anyway, so in Moneyball, they don't succeed, but everybody takes their secret sauce. In basketball, the Spurs do succeed. They succeed wildly. And you can see, like, that's the point. I wrote that article, Are the Spurs Moneyballing the NBA?
Yeah.
And I went, I can point at what they're doing. I can tell you, and every year Arturo puts up a chart, and I'm still amazed by this. Like, I tell people this on podcasts. I'm like, if you're an NBA team, you should steal Arturo. You should steal. I'm not paying him. I wish I could pay Arturo. Arturo's that good. I wish I could pay him. You should steal him. They don't. And then the Spurs literally will choose someone from the top 5 players on Arturo's list.
Yeah.
And you go, wow, their secret is out there, right? There's nothing new about what they're doing if you just dig a little.
Really active feet on the ground scouting program, because it's not just like they take someone from Arturo's list, but they don't, like, I don't think they're just throwing a dart. I mean, you've seen all of the articles about how Kawhi Leonard seems like he was built in a lab to be the perfect Spur temperamentally. That's the fact that he was both on Arturo's list and seems to be like the perfect temperamental Spur and was also drafted by the Spurs isn't an accident. I mean, Kawhi Leonard, there were positional reasons for taking Leonard over Fareed in that draft as well. But think about temperamentally which one makes more sense for the Spurs. They really care about having players that they think Popovich can work with on the team.
Well, there are other things. I mean, I think Fareed would, he's more of a power forward. They were pretty decent. They had the Dia, Duncan splitter core, so they're fine there. Not to mention just. Fareed, I am honestly worried about injury proneness. I mean, he plays so hard, but also Kawhi's like, not only is he built in the lab as temperament for the Spur, his like body is ridiculous. His wingspan and hands are not right. Like, he feels like he was a genetically modified organism to be a basketball player. Right.
I mean, yeah, he looks in a very different way, but like the other Spur that looked like that was David Robinson, of course, but who looks like, if you were designing a basketball player from scratch, you would end up with something that looked a lot like David Robinson. If you were designing a small forward from scratch, you might end up with something that looks a lot like Kawhi Leonard. If you were able to like hack the game to make the hands larger than they're supposed to be able to be. Uh,
Oh, is that? I haven't built a player in any of those games in forever, but that would be hilarious. Like you can't
I've
build
never
Kawhi.
played one, but like I imagine hands are like human hands just aren't supposed to be that big. Like it's ridiculous.
It's the same as like Anthony Davis and having those arms that just should not be.
But what I was gonna say was that so it's not like they're just taking anyone from Arturo's list, right? They're also doing a lot of scouting and they're finding people who will fit into what they call their corporate culture. Papa's he uses lots of terms for this. He's very upfront about it. He talks about needing people who have the right sense of humor, people who have the quote he always has is gotten over themselves. Um, a, a certain like sort of bone deep willingness to put successive team over individual success. And he talks about the fact how fortunate he feels that he has a group of players who permit him to do this kind of minute management stuff for the good of the team. Because of course, minute management is like another way of saying reducing individual stats. And at a time when individual stats are still a large driver for like the contracts people get, at least with teams other than the Spurs, um, you have an entire group of NBA players who have ceded control over their individual stats to an unprecedented degree. Where like none of them got to play as many as 30 minutes a game for an entire season of their NBA careers.
And I mean, and the funny thing is the way you would sell that. One of the rough parts about NBA players is short versus long. You mentioned the ABA. One of the interesting things the ABA did, which I'm actually sad didn't stick around, is they would offer competitive contracts to the NBA, but the way they would do it is they would make them back-end deals and basically form pensions for the players. They'd say, we're going to pay you $1 million over 10 years, but what they really meant is we're going to pay you $400,000. We're going to put a bunch of money in a fee in a fund, and that's going to pay out X thousand a year over the rest of your life so that you actually have a retirement plan. Players hated this, which is actually funny because you look at how many players go bankrupt, you go, you actually need that forward thinking. The Spurs not only have a way of convincing the players, they're going, look, if you look at Kobe versus Duncan, Kobe Bryant, I think maybe he had another couple seasons based on how well he played 2 years ago. But, the fact that he was playing so many minutes and just wouldn't stop, it's like your body can't take this. Whereas Tim Duncan, you say, hey, look, we need to start shutting this down, right? You can't be playing 40 minutes a game like when you were, 25 if you want to be playing when you're 40, which is looking like a possibility, which is ridiculous to me.
I have this fantasy, this crazy dream that is totally not going to happen, but it goes something like this. Anthony Davis finishes his rookie contract and decides to test free agency because, of course, he will be like one of the top 3 players in the league at that point. So, of course, he will decide to test free agency. And at some point, the Spurs go to him and they say, so, you've got a nice career ahead of you. Would you rather it be Kevin Garnett's career or Tim Duncan's career?
I mean, the funny thing is what we mentioned earlier is you go, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But then, of course, the Spurs lucking into another superstar. And Kawhi Leonard, sorry, I was always mess up the last. Yeah, I love how Arturo.
Good job this time. I'm really proud of you.
I know it's funny that Arturo and me together we say it half right. I don't know why. I think there had to have been a hockey player that had like a French Canadian Leonard sound.
I swear there was one podcast where between the two of you had 3 different pronunciations and they were all wrong.
Well, I think you mentioned it and I started calling it out. But anyway, so lucking into Kawhi as a superstar, that should not have happened. And it's driving me bananas that the Indiana Pacers are getting so much credit when you go, this team traded away one of the best small forwards since LeBron James.
Okay,
they traded him away.
I'm going to make an argument in favor of them doing it, and here's how this argument is going to go.
I'm going to cackle maniacally at the end, but go. I'll give you the floor. And actually, you have just said this week's poll. This week's poll was, we do a poll every week. Were the Pacers wrong to let Kawhi Leonard go?
Objectively, it was the wrong thing to do. Leonard's the better player. I'm not arguing that. Obviously, if it's a choice between, keeping Leonard or trading him, you keep him. Although that said, I doubt that the Spurs called up and said, hey, we want to draft Kawhi Leonard. Will you do this trade with us? What they probably said is, we want to trade for your pick. Do you want George Hill? Once the trade had gone through, they said, okay, use it on Kawhi Leonard. The question is, did the Pacers know that Kawhi Leonard was
actually, you're right. I need to look into that because Ty Willinghands of the Milwaukee Bucks, he's a Milwaukee Bucks fan, has pointed out the Dirk Nowitzki trade is not actually that circumstance. It's exactly what you're saying. They traded up. They traded for their pick and said the rules basically say you have to give us your pick regardless, and then they got Dirk. So they didn't necessarily. Okay, so you might. I'll give you that.
So taking that into account, then you think, okay, we're the Pacers. We've got what we think is a pretty okay core, but we don't really have a point guard, and we've got the 15th pick. How can we most rationally use this draft pick? And then you look around what's going on, and you take into consideration, and like I said, this is me spinning a rationale. I have no idea that this is actually.
I'll look into this. If you are correct, I will not make that the poll. But if you are not correct, that is absolutely the poll.
But let me spin this as a rationale. Say I am the GM of a team that is not the Spurs, and I'm looking around, and I have read my Wages of Wins, because it was still Wages of Wins back then, blog posts. And I don't, I'm not statistically competent enough to know if, this is good. I also have people throwing, advanced plus minus at me, and I don't understand this stuff. But I have been persuaded, just by what I've seen in my profession, that the Spurs are, in fact, doing something different and better. And I think this to myself. And they call me up and make this offer. And I think to myself, what is more valuable to me? A point guard when I need a point guard that the Spurs themselves thought that was worth using a pick on, or my own ability to make use of the 15th pick? The question, you can think of it as the Pacers sold the 15th pick for the Spurs' expertise in drafting several drafts ago.
So, by the way, we're over on time, but I'm going to give so that means I'm more willing to do tangents. I bought the Stripped documentary, which is about webcomics and comic strips. And there's a point where the Penny Arcade crew has hired someone named Robert Koo to run their operations. And at one point they ask him, they say, should we have you audited? Because, you're running our business and, we kind of trusted you and that seems wrong. And he goes, oh, you should absolutely have me audited. And then he pauses and goes, but they're not going to find anything. And it's like what you're saying with the Spurs. It's like, should I be suspicious the Spurs want my pick? Oh, absolutely. Are you going to be able to do what the Spurs do? Oh, no.
Right.
So, I kind of agree with your point. Although, to be fair, both Kawhi and Fareed were on the board, and I think Fareed was expected to be on the board. Fareed, when it was the Portland Trailblazers passed him, that's how the Nuggets got him. So, I don't know. Yeah, so we went a little over on what I wanted to write about an hour, but that is great. As anybody who's listened to any podcast with me and EJ, I'll link the three of them, and you'll hear me mention a fourth one that has not gone up because I'm a terrible person. I apologize. We do tend to ramble and go on tangents.
Maybe you should just never put it up, Dre. Maybe you and I should podcast in the future and just constantly reference the amazing things we threw out in the great missing podcast.
We both tire out. What's annoying, as I mentioned, we need an editor because there is good material there. But, you can tell, you're sick, and we've talked for a while, and we're both still engaged, but we're both, you're fading because you're sick. I'm fading because, I've been fixing a garage, and we've been talking for 2 hours. So, if someone edited it, it could be really good, but, as is, it's kind of like watching the end of a boxing match where, both boxers are just... It was
a great podcast. You extemporized what turned out to be, the correct way to numerically categorize team defense, and...
you were talking about Avatar. That would be funny if that was a topic that came.
Just don't give it away, Trey.
Well, we should. There was actually good material in the second half of that podcast, though. but I'll link it. But I'm throwing that out there ahead of time. That I reference a podcast that has not been posted, and as EJ is now saying, may never be posted, and the exploits of which may be, exaggerated to huge degrees in the future.
Yes.
But that said, end of the show. I'll give you an opportunity if you want. We end our shows typically with shout-outs. If you have any, go for it. If you don't, I'll let you think about it. I'll give my shout-outs.
Does it have to be a basketball shout-out?
It can be whatever you want. As we're talking Avatar and other podcasts, but so the first one actually is kind of a cheat. Brian, I'll have you stand up and wave to the audience, or whatever the verbal equivalent of that is.
No, I don't have my camera set up this week, Dre, but here I am talking to you guys. Hello.
All right, so our producer Brian, who is on Twitter as Boxscore Brian, had a fantastic tweet. Hopefully he's putting it up in front of you, because I did link it to him. But after Westbrook's last game, oh, whoa, that did not copy and paste. He commented to me, a comment to people who are tweeting, you want to not just do the @ symbol, because then it only goes to people who follow both of you. So in the future, if you put a dot in front of that, everybody on the internet sees it. He goes, one of the most Westbrook box scores I've ever seen. He got all the stats, all the good ones, all the bad ones, everything. That's such a brilliant, brilliant tweet, Brian. I loved it.
I advise everyone to go out and read that box score. It's very entertaining. And Dre, I'll have to hit you up for some best Twitter practices. My all-time tweets are like 3, so maybe I'll get up to speed on that someday.
All right, my second shout-out, and this is just ridiculous, to be honest, because you're both on the podcast, but you know what? You guys rock this week, and I guess I'll cheat and say my shout-out is to Manu Ginobili. We'll link a fantastic video where Manu Ginobili explains to a bunch of reporters what regression to the mean is. They basically ask the same question the Spurs have heard for years, which is, hey, you were playing really bad. How is it possible? My dog's excited about this. They go, you were playing really bad. How did you go back out there and play well? And he basically went, well, I have an average, and usually my average is better than I was playing. So if I'm playing really bad, odds are I'm going to start playing closer to well again. And he actually says regression to the mean. Classic. You sent that to me.
Manu Ginobili, like any rationalist sports fan, should be a fan of Manu Ginobili because in addition to being one of the most frenetic, interesting, creative basketball players we've ever seen on the court, this is a guy who casually gives impromptu lectures on regression to the mean and drops the word reciprocal in his third language. When he's not playing basketball, he writes ecotourism articles and campaigns for gay rights in Argentina. He's on the record as being interested in rational humanism, and on those occasions when he has bursts of Twitter activity during the season, it's like doing things like asking his fans to help him identify aircraft types. I think the guy is not a stereotypical athlete in any measure.
I think he's on now some level of Dikembe Mutombo, where you go, this person is one of the greatest ever to play the sport. And you look at their off court and you're like, oh, what? This really? Dikembe Mutombo, same kind of thing. So yeah, both players belong together. So EJ, if you don't have any shout outs, it's cool. But if you have any shout outs,
I'm going to give some shout outs. You already took Manu Ginobili, who lives in my heart forever. So I'm going to give some shout outs. So I'm a writer, and my friend's a writer, and I'm going to give some shout outs to friends who have just had novels come out, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely.
So I don't know if anyone listening to this podcast are also readers as opposed to basketball fans. This is the weirdest forum for doing this I can imagine. But 2 friends of mine have just had novels come out. So my friend Monica Byrne has a novel that just came out called The Girl in the Road. It's a novel sort of set in the 2060s and the 2080s about these 2 women, one of whom is sort of moving across Africa, and the other who is moving across India, and she gets to this thing called the Trail, which is this giant chain, sort of mobile links crossing the ocean between India and Africa, harvesting wave energy, and she's fleeing India by sort of crawling across it.
Wow.
And it's just come out. It's gotten rave reviews. It's been blurbed by people like Neil Gaiman and Kim Stanley Robinson. And
this podcast, Neil Gaiman, I'm telling you, that's okay. Neil Gaiman retweets you. You're doing all right. Boxscore Geeks, though, that's when you know you've made it.
Exactly. And then another friend. So that's The Girl in the Road by Monica Byrne. It's in hardback. I just have a paperback here because this is an advanced reader copy. Because she's a friend of mine. And then another friend of mine had a novel that just came out today, which is what made me thought of this. The release date for this novel is today, the day we're recording this podcast, so it'll be a few days later when you hear it, but it will still be in stores. It will be even more in stores, probably. And her name is Genevieve Valentine, and her new novel is The Girls at the Kingfisher Club. And this is sort of, it's like what I understand is it's sort of a 1920s jazz age speakeasy flapper era reimagining of the folktale, The 12 Dancing Princesses. So if that's something you're into, I haven't read it yet because it just dropped today and I just bought it, but I really enjoyed her previous novel, which was called Mécanique, A Tale of the Circus Tresalti, which, if you look at my website, in my recent reading roundup, I did a capsule review of it, and I call it kaleidoscopic steampunk, where it's short chapters that all like gather momentum like an avalanche, and it's a beautiful images, a lot of fun. She's an amazingly talented writer, and if you go to her website, she is bar none my favorite movie critic on the internet. She exclusively does criticism of bad movies and is hilariously snarky and fun.
Is she a fan of how did this get made? Because I'm surprised how much I've loved The Venue.
I mean,
it's such a wide field to have people who criticize intelligently bad movies. I can't believe I'm willing to listen to way more than I already do for that.
Yeah, I mean, she has a series on her website. I think she calls it Questionable Taste Theater. That's well worth just going through the archive of. Anyway,
you've killed my evening, sir. I'm guaranteeing you've killed my evening. Thank you very much.
Anyway, so those are my shout-outs. Monica Byrne with The Girl in the Road, and Genevieve Valentine with The Girls at the Kingfisher Club, both of which have girl in the title. But hey, guess what, geeks? Reading about girls is good for you.
Absolutely. So that is one of the coolest shout-outs. I'm going to do the wind down. So we've had on with us E.J. Fischer, a.k.a. Glorious Hubris on Twitter. You can find him at Eugene. No, sorry, got that moving. You can find him at the website eugenefischer.com, which will include some of the. Okay, so thank you. We'll make sure to link it. But yeah, Fischer spelled Fischer for those of you listening. And then, of course, our great producer, Brian, a.k.a. at Boxscore Brian on Twitter. And I'm Andres Alvarez. I go by Dre. And I'm at Nerd Numbers on Twitter. So thank you so much for being on, and we will see you next week.